Hello. Am I audible now?
Video तो there's a lag, but there's no audio.
There's no audio.
Yeah.
Just check. Hello. Am I audible now? Yeah.
There's a slight lag, but it's
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'm starting. I'll give this to you once I'm done with the intro. Okay. Yeah. So, on behalf of the Development Study Group, I am delighted to welcome you to a lecture on radical political economy and the present crisis by Abhinav Sinha. The Development Study Group is an independent initiative by students at the Faculty of Economics, South Asian University. We organize reading circles, film screenings, and lectures which are armed at pushing students towards understanding social realities and making sense of topics that are usually left out of the economics curricula. With that in mind, I would like to welcome Abhinav Sinha. Abhinav is a political economist and historian whose work explores themes of labor, crisis, and contemporary worker struggle. He received his PhD from University of Delhi, where his research focused on evolution of the labor movement in Delhi from the 1970s onwards. His doctoral thesis culminated in a book published by Brill titled In the Valley of Historical Time 2024 as part of the series called Studies in the Political Economy of Global Labor and War. His other publications include On the Caste Question 2019 and Subversive Interventions 2019. Before we begin the talk, we would like to explain the delay. The SAU administration arbitrarily prevented the speaker, Abhinav Sinha, from entering the campus to deliver planned lecture. This is an attack on academic freedom, which DSG strongly condemns, and we demand an explanation from the university. The talk will last about an hour, after which we will take the questions. Can you take on the mic? Blur the mic.
You can do that.
It's fine.
So, first I would like to thank Development Study Group and the student comrades present here. And I think we don't need to get too disturbed with the attitude of the administration. I take it as a token of respect, in fact. In some way, you can say a symptom of recognition that we are doing something right. Anyway, so since I have small time and the topic is very comprehensive, I would, without any backgrounder, I would just start speaking on the exact topic. So I want to begin with the precise meaning of the terms involved in the topic, because these generally any discussion on radical political economy and crisis, it very soon descends into abstract discussion. So it is good to understand the precise meanings and implications of the terms involved in the topic. For example, radical. Radical means going to the root of things or grasping things by the root. And in the context of academic analysis or intellectual inquiry, it means understanding the fundamental and underlying causes behind any social or political phenomena that is under question. So in political economy, radical political economy would mean if it wants to justify its claim of being radical, it must reveal the fundamental laws that govern the present system, the economic motion of the present system, that is capitalist system. It must reveal the underlying causes of the recurrent cyclical crises that it faces regularly. And without explaining the phenomena like unemployment, inflation, all these economic disturbances that we witness regularly, its claim on being radical would be superfluous. Second term involved here is political economy. Now, in the most generic sense, it refers to a mode of economic analysis which contextualizes the economic phenomena in the broad social and political context rather than reifying and fetishizing the microeconomic behavior of the celebrated hyper-rational individuals, like hyper-rational firms, striving to maximize profit, hyper-rational consumers, striving to maximize utility. There is a notion of perfect competition, perfect knowledge, perfect market, and with all these assumptions, it focuses simply on, kind of an ideological justification of the present economic system. Political economy historically has been a very different kind of discipline, if you will, which puts all the economic phenomena in the broader social and political context and tries to analyze the fundamental causes of the economic phenomena. A little note on the history of political economy is also in order here. Till 1870s, the most commonly used term for academic branches, I mean intellectual division of labor, which is named as economics, was political economy. Political economy was the most used terms for designating the names of the departments, the names of different disciplines, textbooks, etc. 1870s witnessed the revival of the, not revival, in fact, the rise of neoclassical economics. And with that, the usage of the term political economy was kind of pushed back into the oblivion of history of economic thought. But before that, if you look at the history of the term, you find that since the mid 18th century, this term was in use. But the history of the term goes back to the Greek antiquity, where we find both terms: economics, Greek term for economics, and Greek term for political economy. And economics basically referred to the economic analysis of the household, whereas political economy referred to the macroeconomic phenomena, general reproduction of any economic system. In the mid 18th century, if you look at the rebirth of political economy in a new socio-political and economic context, that was rise of capitalism, you see James Stewart's work, an inquiry into the principles of political economy, then Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, then David Ricardo, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. So from the mid 18th century, since the beginnings of industrial capitalism till the period when capitalism entered into its monopoly phase, the last quarter of the 19th century, political economy was the dominantly used term. And from then on, you find the birth of neoclassical economics with its emphasis on the individual actors, highly atomized individual actors who are in the textbooks and classrooms. They are already, doing all the showing perfect behavior. I mean, rationalized behavior, rational choice making individual, and all. Since Great Depression, and especially since the beginning of the long recession in the 1970s, neoclassical economics it was kind of discredited because it failed to explain the current economic phenomena, the outbreak of crisis, etc. And political economy re-emerged, especially in the Marxian circles, but also different schools of heterodox political economy. So this little note was necessary because political economy is not simply equal to economics. It's a very uh, precise discipline which analyzes economic phenomena in social political context. The last term which is used in the topic is crisis. So, what do we mean by crisis? We must be very clear about it. And crisis refers to the general failure of the system to reproduce itself. Capitalist production process regularly witnesses fluctuations and ups and downs, short-term fluctuations, and it has the ability to overcome these fluctuations and these short-term setbacks if the system is internally healthy. If the system is internally healthy, these fluctuations can be absorbed in the general motion of capitalist production and reproduction. But if the system is internally unhealthy, then virtually anything can inaugurate a general crisis, from credit defaults to speculative frenzy, over financialization. Anything can inaugurate the crisis. So these terms are very vaguely used often, and once the point of departure of any discussion on political economy and crisis, skips this stage of, ascertaining the precise meaning and implications of the term, we always run the risk of descending into abstract discussion about abstract things. So that is the first part. The second part, since we are discussing radical political economy and what it means in the present time of crisis, the first question which becomes especially pertinent in this context is the question of reproduction. Now, when we see the capitalist system, we see a system where individual capitalist firms are involved in the production of goods and services independently of each other. There is a competition among capitalist firms. There is a competition between the capitalist class and the working class over their share in the newly added value, profit and wages. There is a competition among workers also, which capitalism imposes upon them. And when we see this whole picture in totality, the first question that occurs to us is not why crisis occurs. The first question which occurs to us is why and how such an anarchic system where the production, circulation, and distribution of various goods and services is not based on any planning, which in turn is based on any prior assessment of the social needs, how such an anarchic system reproduces itself at all when it does. So that is the basic question that we need to ask: how and why the system ever reproduce itself. And once we have established the conditions of reproduction of system, we have automatically also, at the same time, identified the conditions in which the system fails to reproduce itself. So the analysis of reproduction of capitalist system is inherently linked with the question of crisis. These are not two separate questions. Crisis is precisely the general failure of a system to reproduce itself. So both these sets of analysis are actually not two sets of analysis. These are one set of analysis. Now, on the basis of this specific question, how does the capitalist system reproduce itself? We can divide, on the basis of the answers given to this question, we can divide the entire history of modern economic thought into three broad categories. First category refers to the school which believes that capitalist system can reproduce itself automatically ad infinitum. Now, this category has two schools. One is the Neoclassical school, the other is Keynesian school. The second, it goes without saying that for this school, there are no historical limits to capitalist system, which are intrinsic and immanent to the system. So capitalist system is able to reproduce itself automatically ad infinitum. The second school is, you can call it a mirror image of the first category. The second category refers to the category of those who say that capitalist system cannot reproduce itself without an external exogenous factor. That school is basically the underconsumption theories, various kinds of underconsumptionist theories. They believe that capitalism cannot reproduce itself. It cannot accumulate. It cannot expand. It cannot grow, even though it tries to, but it cannot grow. It can only grow if there are external factors, namely an external buyer outside the circuit of capital. For Malthus, this external buyer was the parasitic classes of feudal landlords. For Rosa Luxemburg, this external buyer was the non-capitalist periphery, the third world countries, colonies, semi-colonies, etc. And for Monthly Review School also, Paul Sweezy, Paul Baran, this external buyer is the third world countries, the colonies, semi-colonies, which are still considered as pre-capitalist nations. Why they say this? They say that capitalism produces for consumption. That is the basic ideological prejudice of underconsumption theories, that capitalism produces for consumption. In other words, consumption is the regulator of production in capitalist system. Now, capitalist system therefore is based on demand, basically aggregate demand for the goods and services produced. but the very intrinsic laws of motion of capitalism prevent itself from generating sufficient effective demand, because capitalism does not recognize any demand. It only recognizes effective demand. In other words, demand backed by money. So, by nature, capitalism cannot generate sufficient effective demand, and therefore, capitalism cannot accumulate, grow. It is bound to become stagnant and eventually decline in the absence of any external buyer. The third school is that of Marx's political economy, which says that system under certain conditions can grow, uh, but as the system grows, as the accumulation progresses, the contradictions which are constitutive of the system, in other words, the contradictions on which the system is based, those contradictions become intensified and sharpened. And therefore, from its own internal immanent laws of motion, its intrinsic laws of motion, accumulation faces a crisis. Thus, for Marxist political economy, the limits to the system are not outside the system, absence or presence of an external buyer. It also refutes underconsumptionist arguments that the system cannot grow at all without an external buyer. It says that under certain conditions, the system grows, and the history of capitalism shows that it's a history of accumulation, expanded reproduction, and growth. There is no doubt about it. But the system, as it grows, faces barrier to accumulation, and the sources of barrier to accumulation are not exogenous. They are intrinsic to the very laws of motion, the very logic of capital. And that school basically puts forth the idea of a secular tendency of average rate of profit to fall, or LTFRP, law of tendential fall in the rate of profit. One part is that there is another, you can say, offshoot of Marxist political economy, which is called profit squeeze theorists, who say that it is wages, increasing wages, that cause the decline in the rate of profit. Both agree that there is a secular tendency of the average rate of profit to fall, but the reason given by Marx and the reason given by Marxist profit squeeze theorists are slightly different. So we will consider all these three categories separately in brief. So the neoclassical economics, it emerges from the laissez-faire tradition of the classical political economy. Because as Marx said, the Smiths and Ricardo's political economy had two dimensions. One was the esoteric dimension, the scientific content of Smith's and Ricardo's classical political economy, and the other dimension was the exoteric dimension, which was their ideological failure to understand some of the fundamental laws of the system. So for example, Smith gave the labor theory of value, but once he was unable to reconcile uh, the explanation of profit and the law of equal exchange with each other, he descended to the production cost theory from labor theory of value. So that was the exoteric aspect, and the esoteric aspect is the original Adam Smith, who is firmly standing on labor theory of value. Anyway, so the laissez-faire tradition starts from the classical political economy itself, and neoclassical school is basically a vulgarization of that laissez-faire tradition, which was there in the classical political economy itself. What it says, any economics student knows. So it creates a fable, kind of a fiction. It says that human greed for private benefit is unlimited and insatiable, whereas the resources are limited. That is the first argument. They say that human greed for private gains is human nature. In this way, the greed for profit by capital is imputed upon human beings, and the nature of capital is transformed into human nature. So there is ample historical evidence. If you read anthropological literature, it's not true that accumulating more and more and greed for endless profits, it's not human nature. It came into existence at a particular juncture in the history of social formations. Anyway, so they say that it's human nature, and since there is a conflict between physical nature and human nature, that is endless greed for profit and limited resources, This conflict can be resolved only by a system which gives priority to individual benefits, individual profit maximization, and therefore capitalism is the most efficient system because it is congruent with this alleged human nature, and it gives freest expression to this intrinsic human nature, and therefore the eternal solution to the conflict between nature and human nature, and therefore it is eternal, and therefore they say that if left on its own, capitalist system is able to reproduce itself automatically and smoothly. So they use two adverbs here, automatically and smoothly. For this, they create the fiction of perfect competition, perfect market, hyper rational individuals making totally rational choices based on perfect knowledge, trying to maximize their gains, firms maximizing their profit, consumers maximizing their utility, etc. etc. Now, in reality, none of this exists. Any student of economic history knows that. But so the parable goes. So it says that there is no need for regulation, there is no need for adjustment, there should be no political intervention, and if left on its own, the capitalist system will, automatically reproduce itself in a smooth fashion. But the problem is that as soon as you come out of the textbooks and the classrooms, you find the real world, and the real world is nothing like the parable which is there in the neoclassical theory. In the real world, the real capitalist economy cyclically faces recurrent crises, the crises which are becoming increasingly more structural and deeper with passing time. If you have read about long waves theory, that capitalist mode of production, it has roots in Marx itself, that it has in the secular trajectory, it has waves. So there are waves of prosperity and there are waves of recession or downturn. So the waves of prosperity are becoming smaller and smaller, and the waves of depression are becoming ever longer.
You see the pause for 1 second. We need to run a machine. It will take 30
Okay,
seconds.
no problem.
We can mute it.
Yeah,
So now it's a minute pause for 30 seconds.
Yeah,
we
it's
are
fine.
going because yeah, so even the neoclassical economists cannot, close their eyes to the realities. So one particular branch of neoclassical economics is business cycles theory. One of its prominent scholar, Wesley Clare Mitchell, identified 15 major crises between 1810 and 1920. After 1920, we have, towards the end of the 1920s, Great Depression, even though the profitability was declining since 1926 itself. But the outbreak, the phenomenal outbreak of the crisis happens in 1929. And that Great Depression stays for almost 1 decade, in some countries more than 1 decade. After the Great Depression, there was Second World War, and due to the large-scale destruction of productive forces, there was a period of long boom between 1940s, late 1940s, and late 1960s. But after that, again, from 1973, we are witnessing the what is now being called long recession. Paul Samuelson, the Nobel laureate, one of the most celebrated neoclassical economists, talked about this period of boom. And he said between 1945 and 1975, he records 7 major recessions. So the neoclassical economists are faced with the reality, and then they have no other option but to give two kinds of explanation for crisis. One explanation is that in principle, the capitalist system can reproduce itself automatically and smoothly, but due to exogenous factors, external factors, it does face crisis. And what includes in those external factors? Two things. One is natural factors like crop failures, sunspots, floods, earthquakes, etc. The other is the subjective factor of human psychology. So there is a theory that in human psychology you have waves of despair and optimism. So during the waves of despair, you tend to spend less, and during the waves of optimism, you spend more. There is a period of exuberance. So these factors are responsible for crisis. Otherwise, capitalist system is able to reproduce itself automatically and smoothly. But the crises were too punctual and too recurrent and too obstinate to be explained away by these exogenous factors. So another school, the business cycles school, emerged within the tradition of neoclassical economics. It says that yes, the system does face short-term fluctuations, and it is a rhythm inbuilt into the very process of capitalist production, that there are some short-term setbacks and fluctuations and ups and downs. But this is not the cause of crises. So when the business cycle theorists are faced with the question of explaining long crises, for example, even in 1939, in the US, the unemployment was 10 million, official statistics. So almost 1 crore people unemployed. The condition of France, Germany, and Britain was no better. The official unemployment rates hovered between 22% and 26% in these advanced European capitalist countries. So once they are faced with that kind of situation, they fall back on exogenous factors, business cycle theories. But the orthodox neoclassical economics was not willing to give any space to business cycle theory also, because the moment it was like conceding too much. It was dangerous. Once you concede this much, that system, due to its inherent motion, does face ups and downs and fluctuations. It's problematic. So till the rise of Keynes, business cycle theory was put on the margins of orthodox economics. With Great Depression, the you know it made the neoclassical economists surly and irritable and embarrassed, because they were not able to explain what is happening, because these are not short-term setbacks or fluctuations. Enter Keynes. So Keynes says that this is the other branch of neoclassical economics, in my opinion. Some people think that Keynesian economics is not part of neoclassical economics, but it shares all the basic ideological prejudices of the neoclassical economics, as we will see. But Keynes says that system cannot reproduce itself smoothly. It can reproduce itself, but it can reproduce itself only with persistent unemployment and or inflation. So what is to be done? So Keynes says that the Say's law is a myth. Production does not create its own demand, and therefore, in the capitalist economy, you see the investments of capitalists are driven by what Keynes used to call animal spirits, the violently volatile expectations of profit. So investments are based on that, uh, and due to that, the net investment can never be adequate and proportionate to absorb all the disposable labor and means of production. And therefore, the system cannot reproduce itself smoothly. It can reproduce itself, but only with persistent unemployment. If we want the system to reproduce itself smoothly also, then we need a little help from our friend, the state. The state should do deficit spending. By deficit spending, it should spur the aggregate demand. This impetus to aggregate demand will give impetus to investment, and deficit spending will not cause inflation till near full employment is achieved. Once near full employment is achieved, only then deficit spending can cause inflation. So for Keynes, high unemployment and inflation cannot coexist. That is one of the basic assumptions of Keynesian economics. That's why Keynesian economics collapsed with 1973 crisis, which was identified with, the coincidence of high unemployment and inflationary pressure, stagflation, basically. So Keynes says that with states' proper adjustment and management, capitalism can reproduce itself not only automatically but also smoothly. So the basic foundations of Keynesianism are same. Production is done for consumption. The society is divided into consumers and producers, not classes. Supply and demand are independent variables determining prices. And it is based on a static equilibrium, notion of static equilibrium. For neoclassical economics, that static equilibrium is reproduced constantly, automatically by the system. For Keynes, it is not automatic. The equilibrium can be achieved only based on states' adjustment and management of the economy. So a part of neoclassical orthodoxy was willing to accommodate Keynes into their system because he also accepted that system can reproduce itself either with turbulence in case of absence of state intervention or with smoothness in case of presence of state intervention. So every crisis for Keynesian was always explained in terms of policy failure. So there was an absence of proper management of the economy. There was no sufficient deficit spending, and here business school theory comes to fore again. So if the state has to determine the kind of intervention it wants to make, we should have our finger, on the pulse of the system, the ups and downs and short-term fluctuations. Based on the study of those short-term fluctuations, the state can determine the modality of its intervention. 73 crisis, it was like the moment of embarrassment for Keynesian economics because they were not. That was the period in which welfare policies were implemented, state regulation was implemented between late 1940s and early 1970s. And despite state regulation, despite all kinds of help from this little friend, the crisis was stubborn and punctual, and it struck the system towards the end of the 1960s itself. But the declaration of the outbreak was 1973, the collapse of dollar gold standard, and then the OPEC oil crisis in 74. So this failure of Keynesians to explain how high rates of inflation and high rates of unemployment are coexisting with each other in presence of state regulation and intervention, they tried to, come up with new versions of the Phillips curve, the celebrated Phillips curve of the Keynesians to explain this mechanism, but they were not able to explain it. It saw revival of two things. One, Marxist political economy saw big time revival. This was the period when John Weeks was writing, Anwar Shaikh was beginning to write. There was Andrew Kleiman, Alan Freeman, Guglielmo Carcedi, all these stalwarts of Marxian political economy. Yeah, they became, talk of the town during this period itself. And the second tendency which was revived was the neoliberal variant of the neoclassical economics, Milton Friedman, who said that at the acceptable wage, capitalism can give employment to everyone. And if statistics show you that there are unemployed people, these are people who are not willing to work. They have stopped looking for work. So actually, we are already at the full employment. And this is the most optimum system. At the acceptable wage for capital, everyone can be employed. Of course. So this is the first category, neoclassical orthodoxy and Keynesian heterodoxy within neoclassical orthodoxy. The second category is that which claims that capitalism is inherently incapable of self-expansion, growth, and therefore survival because the system would stagnate and eventually collapse. It is the mirror image of neoclassical school, and it is as old and I think even older than the neoclassicals. They argue that the system cannot reproduce itself because capitalist production happens for consumption. Consumption can be measured only by effective demand. Capitalist system cannot generate sufficient effective demand, and therefore it cannot accumulate, it cannot self-expand, it cannot reproduce itself. It is doomed to stagnation and eventual collapse if there is no external buyer, a buyer external to the capitalist system. It can be within the capitalist country or it can be outside the capitalist country, but outside capitalist relation, that is formal wage relation and capital relation. There are many sub-schools of underconsumptionism. There is a reactionary underconsumptionism, there is a reformist underconsumptionism, and there is a Marxian underconsumptionism. We'll come to that. But Common to all underconsumptionist school is the concept of demand gap. That is essential to all underconsumptionist schools. So we can understand it in very short. They divide the entire production into two broad departments. I mean, Marx also divides production into two broad departments. One is department one, which produces producer goods. The other is department two, which produces consumer goods. Underconsumptionists argue that department one is vertically subordinated to department one. Department one is vertically subordinated to department two. That is consumer demand for consumer goods, demand for consumption, individual consumption, not productive consumption, is the regulator of production. Therefore, the sectors which produce machinery and means of production, their demand is a derivative of the demand of consumer goods department. That is the basic assumption of underconsumptionism, that production is determined and regulated by consumption. Note here that they are not saying that the demand for consumer goods influences department one, producer goods department. They are saying that it determines the demand for department one, that is producer goods. The second point that they put forth is that in order to understand the concept of demand gap, that there is a category called total social product. That is the total production of all goods and services of whatever kind. That is the total social product. It consists of two basic parts. One is replacement product, which is the commodities which go into replenishing the spent inputs of production. Replacement product. Over and above, whatever remains in the total social product is net product, which is product over and above those products which are necessary to replace the spent inputs of production. The net production in turn is divided into necessary product, which goes into the consumption of workers, and surplus product, which goes into the consumption of capitalists. So there is total social product divided into replacement product and net product. Replacement product goes into replacing the spent means of production. Net product is the product over and above that, and it is consumed by capitalists and workers. So it has two parts. One is necessary part, because its labor is necessary for the reproduction of system. That is why it is called necessary product. And the other is surplus product, which goes into the consumption of capitalists. Parallel to this supply side production, we have income side. So parallel to total social product, we have total income. There are two parts of total income. One is fixed capital, which goes into the replacement of spent of buying the producer goods which have been expended. The other is the net income, which generally economists call net national income. That net national income has two parts: profits and wages. Profits go into are used for the consumption of the capitalists, and wages are used for the consumption of workers. So basically, net production has two sides: supply side, which has the net product, and effective demand side, which has the net income, which can be divided into wages and profits. Now here comes the basic paradox of underconsumptionism. They say that workers are systemically obliged to spend all their wages to buy back their part of the net product, because workers cannot be allowed to accumulate to the extent. They are not allowed to cross that threshold limit of saving, where saving becomes capital, investable capital. So workers are systemically obliged to spend all of their wages for the reproduction of their labor power. But the capitalists don't do that. The internal competition among capitalists, it obliges them to compete with each other for what? It's a price competition to undersell each other. In order to undersell your opponent, you'll have to modernize. You'll have to increase the productivity of labor. If the labor productivity increases, then per unit cost goes down, per unit price goes down, you can undersell your opponent. So accumulation is a structural obligation for capitalists. So they are not going to spend all of their profits on their consumption. Therefore, their part of surplus product is not totally realized. This creates a demand gap, lack of effective demand. And this is the basic argument of the underconsumptionists. Due to this demand gap, which increases, widens, because with the development of productive forces, the productive capacity of the system increases and the demand gap also increases. And this is the Achilles heel of the capital system, due to which, in the absence of any external buyer, it cannot reproduce itself. It needs an external buyer. It can be an internal parasitic class, it can be a non capitalist periphery, or it can be the political intervention of the state, which is external to capitalism. For example, deficit spending to increase the social wages of workers, etc. So, whenever there is a secular period of expansion of capitalist system, the underconsumptionists always try to explain that based on some external buyer. That they would either say that there was this parasitic class which was filling up the demand gap, or there was a non-capitalist periphery. But empirically, it can be shown that in various advanced countries, even in the absence of colonies, because even when colonial mode was the uh, you know uh, modus vivendi of imperialism, even then trade within capitalist world was many times higher than trade between the colonial world and the advanced capitalist countries. So it can be shown empirically that capitalist system did experience, and it has experienced time and again, secular trajectories of prosperity and expansion, and it cannot be explained away by the presence of some external buyer. So anyway, there are different categories of underconsumptionist school. One is the reactionary underconsumptionism, which was the main figure of reactionary branch of underconsumptionism is Malthus. Malthus, who is also infamous for his population theory, he said that a sustainable growth rate should be maintained. Too much saving and too much accumulation is bad. But he never said how much accumulation is good. The logic said that only one rate of accumulation is good, zero, because any accumulation will create demand gap. So he says that uh, in order to deal with this problem, we should celebrate the existence of the parasitic classes and their obscene, opulence and uh, extravagance. So let them survive. They are our panacea. They will allow us to fill this demand gap. We'll see that this class is actually not external, because rent and interest, they are derivatives of profit and wages themselves. They are not independent forms of income. They are basically either redistribution of appropriated surplus value or deduction from wages. Both can happen. The second was reformist underconsumptionism, the father of which was Sismondi, Simonde di Sismondi, whom Marx has criticized as a petty bourgeois socialist. So he said that he focused on the depression of wages of workers. So he says that workers are being deprived of even living wages, and they cannot even buy back their part of the net product, and therefore we should focus on increasing wages. State intervention should be done, cooperatives should be made, etc., etc. Some kind of petty bourgeois romantic solution to the problem of filling the demand gap. And at the same time, he also argued that foreign trade is not sufficient for that, because if the foreign trade is mostly happening among capitalist countries, the gain of one party will be the loss of the other party. As a whole, the world capitalist system cannot fill the demand gap by foreign trade. So the only way is to, involve in some kind of reformist measures to increase the wages. Struggle for higher wage. The higher wages is the solution. Fast forward to 19th century. Late 19th century, early 20th century, in fact, J.A. Hobson. He comes from that tradition only. But between the time of Sismondi and Hobson, the European foreign investments increased by 700%. It was the period of monopoly capitalism and imperialism. And during this time, imperialism wars, they had become a big issue. And Hobson's imperialism is basically a study of imperialism, where he says that imperialism is the result of this demand gap. Because advanced capitalist countries, there are monopolies, there is monopoly pricing. Monopoly pricing, in turn, depresses the wages and decreases the effective demand. At the same time, productive capacity is increasing, so the economic surplus is increasing, and this economic surplus can be absorbed only in the colonies and semi-colonies. So there is a scramble for colonies among advanced capitalist powers, and result is war, destruction, and waste. And he says, I have the solution. The solution is that you increase wages by state intervention, and you implement progressive taxation. So there is a redistribution of wealth through progressive taxation and increased wages. Through that, the demand gap can be filled, and we don't need imperialist policy, the policy of imperialism. Rosa Luxemburg and Monthly Review School both borrowed heavily from Hobson's argument, as we'll see. But before we go to Rosa Luxemburg, we have to see what kind of response was given to the underconsumptionists by Marx and Lenin. Marx totally destroyed the basic foundations of underconsumptionist argument, and we'll understand how in very brief. The first point, he says that total social product at any given time is divided into, it consists of both consumer goods and producer goods. Effective demand, according to underconsumptionists also, originates from three sources. One is replacement demand, fixed capital. The second is demand created by workers' consumption, expressed by money wages, and demand created by profit, which again can be divided into two parts: individual consumption of capitalists and net investments. So these three types of effective demands must fulfill demand gap. Now, what underconsumptionists, the third point of Marx, what underconsumptionists don't understand is the element of time. And element of time is very central to Marxist analysis all the time. If you are reading the first volume, which is the sphere of production, the second volume, sphere of circulation, the third volume, capitalist system as a whole, everywhere the element of time is central to Marxian analysis. So he says that the workers and capitalists both do not buy from the current cycle of production. They buy from the net product of the previous cycle of production. So, because the product of the current cycle will become available only at the end of the current cycle. Now, I'm not going into the, complexities of the issue, because the turnover period of different capitals are not same. But still, there are ways to calculate the average turnover of total social capital. So in that sense, at the level of many capitals we are talking, not at the level of individual capital. So workers and capitalists as a whole, socially speaking, they buy from the total social product of the previous cycle, and effective demand in the current cycle can be generated if the new investments are adequate and proportionate to absorb the remaining surplus product, in order to fill the demand gap from the previous cycle. So actually the real question is that whether in the next cycle of production we can find sufficient effective demand to absorb the surplus product of the previous cycle or not. That is the real question. And second thing, Marx says that the real effective demand originates within the capitalist class. Why? Because workers' consumption is the function of original capital investment. Wages are part of capital investment. So workers cannot buy back more than the value of their wages. They will only buy back that value which has been given to them in the form of wages. They cannot buy more than that. So the question of surplus product and effective demand for the remaining part of the net product, which is not being realized, is not resolved by workers' consumption. So the real effective demand for capitalist system originates within the capitalist class, not within the working class. Third point of Marx is that even within the capitalist demand, the demand for producer goods is the determining factor. Capitalist class consumption is not the independent variable. It depends on the investment decisions taken by the capitalists. So the regulator of this question is the demand for producer goods, the new investments undertaken by the capitalists in the current cycle of production. That is the key element which shows that if there is sufficient increase in the net investment, the demand gap can be filled. And because new investment would mean demand for new consumer goods, because for capitalist private consumption and new workers will be hired, so workers demand will also increase, and demand for producer goods, so both demands will increase and the demand gap can be filled. So what Marx is saying, under certain conditions capitalist system can reproduce itself. He's not saying that it will always reproduce itself. He says under certain conditions, capitalism inherently is capable of self-expansion, growth, and expanded reproduction, accumulation. So that is the critique that Marx put forth. Uh, Now we fast forward a little bit. Russian populist Marxist in Russia towards the end of the 19th century. Capital Volume 2, where Marx presents this analysis, was published in 1885. So Russian populist Marxists, they read only Capital Volume 1. And they argued that they understood how surplus value and surplus product, the process of production happens. And they asked, where are the consumers for that? Where is the effective demand? They said Western capitalist countries can resolve this problem of demand gap because they have colonies, they are more competitive, they can fight in the world market. Russia doesn't have colonies, is not as competitive as the French, German, or British capital. So in Russia, we will not witness the stage of capitalism. Capitalism cannot develop in Russia, and we can skip capitalist stage directly from the communal mode of production to socialism. We can just take a leap from that. So four people mainly responded to this populist argument: Tugan Baranovsky, Bulgakov, Peter Struve, and most importantly, Lenin. What they said, that first of all, your arguments are disproved by history, because in Russia we are witnessing extremely rapid development of capitalism. So capitalism is indeed developing. Whatever fiction you are creating is theory, notwithstanding, capitalism is developing. And secondly, under certain conditions, capitalism can create market for its production. This school bifurcates into many parts. This school bifurcates into the Harmonist school and the Leninist Marxist school. Harmonist school was led by Tugan Baranovsky, who said that if only we can maintain the proportionality of production between departments, then capitalism can reproduce itself ad infinitum. So planning is the key. This argument was taken later in the early 20th century by German social democrat, revisionist Rudolf Hilferding. He said that in the age of monopolies and the rise of state monopolies, it has become possible to organize capitalism and plan it, because one state monopoly is controlling and regulating the production. All we Marxists have to do is to involve in parliamentary struggle for planning and regulation of economy. That's what Hilferding says. Lenin vehemently disagrees. He says no amount of planning and no amount of state regulation can rid the capitalist system of its anarchy. The reason is that the contradiction lies at the very level of production, and that contradiction is the contradiction between private appropriation. The private appropriation can be done by state capitalists, and socialized production. And Lenin says, look at the wartime German economy, one of the most state-regulated economy, WUMBA. It's a abbreviation for a German term, wartime German economy, and still they faced crisis. So state regulation or organized capitalism or planning of production is not the answer. The question is of class, and the class contradiction expressed between in the form of a principal contradiction between bourgeoisie and capitalist class, bourgeoisie and proletariat, and in the fundamental sense between labor and capital, or socialized production and private appropriation. And that is why anarchy of the system cannot be done away with. Anyhow, so Rosa Luxemburg responded to Harmonist school in a pathological fashion. She says that if capitalism can be planned and organized to avoid all kind of crises and anarchy, then the objective need of socialism is not there anymore. Socialism is not the objective need emerging from the inherent contradictions of capitalism. And she says this argument is based on Marx's reproduction schema, where he criticizes the reproduction schema of Marx and says that in reproduction schema presented in the second volume, Marx does show that capitalism can reproduce itself under certain conditions, but it is possible only algebraically, but not in the real world. She repeats the old underconsumptionist argument and says that demand gap has to be filled, and uh, foreign trade among the capitalist country is not the solution, because gain of one party is the loss of another party. And also she says that landlord's rent or usurer's interest cannot be the solution, these parasitic clauses, because these income forms are derivative of distribution of surplus value, redistribution of surplus value, or deduction from wages. So that is also not going to solve the problem. The problem will be solved through imperialism. Imperialist scramble for colonies and semi-colonies, the non-capitalist periphery, she called the third buyer. The third buyer is outside in the non-capitalist periphery, but she doesn't reach the reformist conclusions of Hobson. She says that as that periphery shrinks, because when the non-capitalist periphery comes into contact with the advanced capitalist countries, the pre-capitalist modes of production disintegrate and capitalism develops. So capitalist expansion and imperialism itself kills the golden goose. It kills the source of its reproduction, because the non-capitalist periphery shrinks, capitalist rivalry sharpens, wars, destruction, revolutionary situation, ultimate breakdown of system and revolution. That's what Rosa Luxemburg's theory was. But there were two obvious problems. One, if the non-capitalist periphery is constant net buyer, where is the extra revenue coming from? And the second is, again, missing the element of time that we already talked about, that the effective demand of the current cycle is to realize the net product of the previous cycle, not the current cycle. So the movements of profitability can determine the growth and accumulation of the capitalist system without any third buyer. So what she forgot is profitability is the regulator of the system. As Marx said, that the circuit of capital is money, commodity, more money, MCM prime. It's not like simple commodity production where the aim is CMC, commodity, money, commodity. Aim is not consumption. That was during the period of simple commodity production. In the capitalist commodity production, the aim is more profit. So production does not happen for consumption, it happens for profit. Consumption happens as a byproduct of the motion of the system. So there is no reason why the capitalists cannot grow richer by selling to each other producer goods, war machinery and weapons, and luxury goods. There is no need to believe that the mass consumption by the masses, effective demand of individual consumer goods determines the growth of the system. It doesn't mean that individual consumption doesn't happen. For example, if I choose to produce weapons, I would of course employ workers, and it would create some kind of effective demand for consumer goods also. But I'm not employing workers to feed them. That's what the capitalists say. कि हम तुमको रोजी रोटी दे रहे हैं, है ना? But that's not the truth. They are investing for profit. Profitability is the regulator of the system. Then comes the monthly review school, that is based on basically a mixture of Rosa Luxemburg's argument and left Keynesian. Basically, John Robinson, Kaleski, Joseph Steindl. So they mix all of that up and they add only two things. They say that the capitalists increase the organic composition of capital, that is capital labor intensity. They invest more on machinery to increase productivity. So the demand gap increases faster than expected. Secondly, monopoly through monopoly pricing curtails the effective demand. So the demand gap constantly increases and leads the system to stagnation and collapse. That is their basic thing. Again, problematic thing, because productivity is increased not only in the consumer goods industry. They are assuming that every rise in productivity is affecting only the consumer goods industry. Productivity increase is happening in the producer goods industry also. Second problem is that he says that monopolies modernize even faster. So people asked monthly review people that if the monopolies are unable to sell their current stock, if they are unable to utilize their current capacity, why would they modernize? Competitive capitalist is obliged by competition to modernize. Why would a monopoly capitalist be obliged to modernize? Anyway, the point is, underconsumptionism in general fails logically and empirically to explain the reproduction of the capitalist system. And it can be proven wrong empirically, and it can be proven wrong logically. Logically we did, empirically you can study, go back and study. Then the question arises that can system reproduce itself ad infinitum? And if not, what are the limits to the system? Marx doesn't say that capitalism can reproduce itself ad infinitum. He also says that capitalists often do increase productive capacity faster than consumption, but it only creates short-term fluctuations. If supply increases vis-a-vis demand, the prices will fall back. And any effective demand is an effective demand at a given price. And any supply is absorbable supply at a given effective demand. So, in and by themselves, supply and demand explain zero, nada, nothing. They have to be explained. So he says that these realization problems only create short-term fluctuations, and system is able to correct itself through flow of capital across branches and emergence of a new social division of labor. So if one is oversupplied, some capital from that sector will flow to another sector, supply will go down there, prices will rise, another sector will become overcrowded, and this turbulent equilibration continue to happen to absorb the short-term fluctuations. So the real question is, how can system reproduce itself? Under what conditions? Marx already answers that under the conditions of adequate and proportionate new investments, which can absorb the net product of the previous cycle, system can expand. But what regulates investments? Marx's answer is, it is the movement of profitability which regulates investment. The answer to this question was for the first time given in a proper fashion by Marx. Keynesians talk about volatile short-term expectations of profits based on subjective thing. Marx says it's not subjective thing. Once you invest in something and don't get the desired result from the market, you get a feedback impact and you customize. So it's not about short-term subjective animal spirits and volatile violent expectations of capitalists for profit. It is a structural factor which is inbuilt into the very movement of the system. So when investments decline, a demand gap does open. Underconsumption does happen. But it is not the cause of the crisis, it is the symptom of the crisis. Since it coincides with crisis, it appears as if underconsumption has caused the crisis. But if appearance and essence were the same, then there was no need for science. So Marx says that the regulator of production is profit. Marx's second point, to which we'll come, why it happens, that there is a long-term tendency of the average rate of profit to fall. When the average rate of profit falls, investments go down, employment goes down, demand for producer goods goes down, underconsumption happens, but only as a symptom of the crisis. And the fact that average rate of profit falls was known by Adam Smith. He couldn't give the correct explanation why it happens. Ricardo also knew it. He gave the theory of law of diminishing returns. Marx showed that it's not true empirically. But then why rate of profit falls? Everybody knew. Today people say, where is the rate of profit? Ambani is getting richer. That is like a kind of impressionistic analysis. That is not, the opulence of Adani is not a measure of the health of the system. Monopolies grow even in the times of crisis. In fact, monopolies grow faster in the times of crisis because they are able to buy, swallow small capital. Anyway, so how does Marx explain? The first point that Marx says, that in every society has to make an allocation of total social labor in definite quantities and in definite proportions in order to fulfill the needs of the society. That is what Marx called, and Adam Smith had also called, social division of labor. Distribution of labor in definite proportion to different branches of production. Before capitalism, this division of labor was determined either politically or by law, by tradition, by convention. But in capitalism, what happens? Different individual capitalists are engaged in the production of various goods and services without any prior planning. I just heard this sentence in a web series. All planning is prior. So prior planning is oxymoron, without any planning. And investments are based on the movements of profitability. The movement of profitability is expressed in the movement of prices. There is no other indicator to, the prices, the cost, price minus cost is equal to net profit. But profit and prices themselves are determined by the total social labor of society. Marx was not the first one to say that, it was Smith. He said that the total value of total product of the society is determined by the total social labor of society. So prices are determined by the direct and indirect labor spent in the production of commodity, and profit is based on the surplus value created by the workers in the surplus labor time, which is the labor time over and above the necessary labor time which the workers require to reproduce value equivalent to their wages. So that is surplus value, and surplus value determines profit. In the process of production, workers use instruments of labor to transform raw material into finished product. So the total labor time spent in the production of a commodity is indirect labor time, that is labor time spent in the production of means of production, and the direct labor time spent by the workers in the current production process. So the value of commodity is determined by indirect and direct labor time. In other words, you can say that total labor time or value of the commodity is equal to C plus L, or constant capital representing past indirect labor, and L, the current working day. The living labor is spent in one working day. Now, in the direct labor time, the workers must first produce value equal to their wages, which is value equal to the value of wage goods that the workers socially on an average consume in order to reproduce their labor power. In one line, the consumption of goods that goes regularly into the reproduction of labor power. And over and above the value of wages, the workers must produce surplus value, otherwise nobody will hire the workers. No capitalist would hire the workers. So the direct labor time has two parts: necessary labor time and surplus labor time. In other words, the direct labor time is equal to V plus S. V, variable capital, which represents the necessary labor time, wages, and S, surplus value, which represents the surplus product or the surplus value in money terms. So for Marx, and Marx says that this division of direct labor time between necessary labor time and surplus labor time is the basis of capitalist society, because without that, the capitalist class would be deprived of its means of consumption and its means of rule, state's expenditure as well as the individual expenditure of the capitalist class. So without this distinction, capitalist system cannot exist, capitalist class cannot exist, any ruling class cannot exist without surplus product. That surplus product takes the form of surplus value only in capitalism. That is a different issue. So for Marx, the measure of exploitation is the ratio between the surplus labor time and necessary labor time. That is what he calls the rate of surplus value, or the rate of exploitation, or surplus value divided by wages, variable capital, S upon V. I'm oversimplifying things. There are, intricate differences between all these categories, but there is no time to explain that. Just for a popular exposition of the problem, I'm toying with accuracy a little bit. Anyway, so direct labor time in any country is always given and known at any given time. That is the average length of the working day. For example, now it is, for majority of Indian working class, 93% is more than 10 hours, 10 hours to 12 hours. So general length of working day is in any given time is generally known and given. The wages are also, value of labor power is also given, because the prices of wage goods in any given time is known. So there is only one way to increase the rate of surplus value, because once the capitalists are able to increase the rate of surplus value, only then, given all other things equal and constant, the mass of profit and the rate of profit can increase. So all capitalists individually try to maximize the rate of surplus value. It can be done in two ways. One is that you expand the total working day. So wages are given, so surplus labor time increases. But This method was employed in the early stages of capitalist mode of production because of two reasons. One is social reason, one is physical reason. You cannot expand the working day beyond a certain limit. Beyond a certain limit, which is a physical limit, beyond which the workers will not be able to reproduce their labor power to continue to work. And the second is class struggle of the workers, the challenge posed by the workers against the prolongation of the working day. Due to this, as capitalism developed, the capitalist class employed the second method, which Marx calls relative surplus value, where the total direct labor time or the working day remains the same, but the value of labor power is decreased by increasing the productivity of labor in those industries which produce wage goods. So if wage goods are cheapened, then the value of labor power goes down and the wages of the workers can be decreased. So the necessary labor time is decreased, surplus labor time is increased. Total labor time is the same still, but surplus labor time increases, surplus value increases, the rate of surplus value increases. And all capitalists try that, all kinds of method even today. They try to prolong the working day also, but the principal method today is not the prolongation of the working day for obvious reasons, already stated reasons. But here comes the fix. Marx says it is precisely these individual endeavors to increase the rate of surplus value that eventually leads to a fall in the rate of profit. How? This is the paradox. So Marx says that for capitalists, the thing to consider is not the rate of surplus value. Generally, they don't even know about the rate of surplus value. They consider the rate of profit, which is profit upon total investment, not profit upon wages, not S upon V, not surplus value upon variable capital, but surplus value upon constant capital plus variable capital, total capital investment. So the internal competition among capitalists, it obliges the capitalists to increase the productivity of labor in all industries. Now, productivity increase in any industry will not lead to decrease in the value of labor power. Then what will it lead to? It will lead to the cheapening of, per unit cheapening of the product, because the worker is spending the same amount of labor, but in the same amount of labor, since the productivity is increased, it is producing a larger mass of commodities. So the same value is distributed over a larger mass of commodity. So per unit cost and price of the commodity goes down. And this is what the competition among capitals is all about. But as this, and also due to, the class struggle of the working class, also in order to decrease the bargaining capacity of the working class, uh, capitalists employ modern technology and machinery, etc. But the principal reason is the competition among capital. With this, the capital labor ratio increases. So larger mass of means of production are now being operated by the same number of workers or even declining number of workers. This is what Marx called rising organic composition of capital. So this brings us to the solution of the paradox. So we understood that S upon V is the rate of surplus value and S upon C plus V is the rate of profit. What can be the notional maximum for the rate of surplus value? Marx said, when workers live on air, so wages tend towards zero, so S max would be S max upon C only, because V tends to zero. V never becomes zero. It is just an explanatory demonstration. So let's suppose V becomes zero. Totally mechanized production, no workers. So that, if that happens, surplus value also finishes, because in the beginning a lot of people thought that if rate of surplus value is S upon V and V becomes zero, then S becomes infinite. But that's not true. Why? That is why mathematics is one thing and political economy is another thing. S is function of V. If V becomes zero, S suddenly after a long leap crashes down to zero. So V tends to zero. So in the rate of profit, maximum surplus value, maximum possible rate of surplus value will lead to a situation where the rate of profit will be expressed by S upon C, because V tends to zero. That is the ultimate ceiling of surplus value. You cannot have a higher rate of surplus value or a larger mass of surplus value. But the C continues to increase. because increasing constant capital and increasing labor capital intensity of production is about increasing a larger mass of use value in the same labor time. It's not about decreasing the value of the labor power. So due to competition among capital, C or constant capital continues to increase, and as S approaches its maximum limit, and as V approach its minimum limit, the rate of profit ultimately falls, because the rate of surplus value at some times it can counteract the rising organic composition of capital, but as soon as it is approaching its ceiling, an organic composition of capital grows as a law of nature, as a force of nature. It will grow due to internal competition among capitals. As soon as that limit is reached, the rate of surplus value is outstripped by organic composition of rising organic composition of capital, and the rate of profit will fall. So rate of surplus value is a countervailing factor. The other countervailing factor against the fall of rate of profit is the cheapening of machinery, because productivity is also increasing in producer goods industry. So per unit cost of machine is decreasing. So C is also becoming smaller. But we are considering the case of accumulation, not disaccumulation. So even though per unit cost of machine decreases, the new mass of machine due to expanded reproduction costs more on the whole. So what happens is this: cheapening machines and increase in the rate of surplus value temporarily can halt the fall in the rate of profit. They convert an absolute law into a tendential law. It is converted into a tendency. So it's a long-term or secular tendency, the fall in the rate of profit. Of course, capitalist system is not in perpetual crisis all the time. So it's a secular tendency, and ultimately it falls. Now the people within bourgeois academia and especially neoclassical economics try to show that it doesn't fall. They try to, cajole academics, honest political economists, to somehow torture the statistics to show that it doesn't fall, but it's the same. They tortured Galileo to say that the earth doesn't move. So Galileo wrote and yet it moves after his apology. So the spirit Marx would emerge from its grave and it would say, and yet it falls. Whatever games you play with your statistics in bourgeois academia doesn't matter. And it is not about even proving. History proves that the rate of profit has fallen from the periods of industrial revolution from 27-28% now to 7-6%. The average rate of profit of capitalist system as a whole. There are many excellent statistical studies about it. You can read, if you go a little back to the 1960s, Victor Perlo, he wrote a very good empirical study of historical tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Then in our time and few decades ago, Anwar Sheikh, Andrew Klein, Alan Freeman, Guglielmo Carcetti, Michael Roberts, Esteban Maito has calculated world rate of profit in one of his papers, and you can see that the average rate of profit does fall, and it is this which is the inherent limit to accumulation. So in words of Marx, the barrier to capital is capital itself. The very laws of motion of capital lead to fall as a secular tendency, fall in the average rate of profit. And this is the underlying cause of crises, recurrent cyclical crises. Now, Marx doesn't say, like Rosa Luxemburg, he doesn't give any ultimate breakdown theory or something like that. He doesn't say that crises by themselves automatically turn into revolutionary situation or collapse of the system. Marx says every crisis is pregnant with dual potential, reactionary potential and revolutionary potential. It depends on the organization, relative organization of different class forces, which determines which potential is realized. And that is why the slogan, often attributed to Rosa Luxemburg, but first given by Engels, was socialism or barbarism. So crisis only creates an objectively revolutionary situation, potentially revolutionary situation. Systems don't collapse on their own. They have to be overthrown. That is the law of history. Systems see a historical trajectory of rise, stasis, and fall. We are in the latter part of the system. Objectively speaking, it is the twilight of capitalist mode of production. Subjectively speaking, we are in the valley of historical time. We cannot, the situation of the working class movement cannot worsen even further. इससे बुरा कुछ हो नहीं सकता जो अभी है. But we have not started the ascent yet. So we are in the valley of historical time. The descent is over because nothing can be worse, but the ascent is yet to begin. And a short note on profit squeeze theory. They also accept that rate of profit falls, but they say that the rate of profit falls because due to the class struggle of workers, wages increase, and therefore due to wage increment, in the new value, the proportion of profit falls. Now, Marx says, and Ricardo knew it, Ricardo also said that increasing wages in and by themselves do not cause a decline in the rate of profit. They can exacerbate the fall in the rate of profit if it is already happening. So it can exacerbate the situation. It cannot create the situation. Some Marxist political economists said that. Glynn, Sutcliffe, Rothon, these were the Marxist political economists who talked about wage squeeze theory, profit squeeze theory. It comes from Bastiat and Carey, bourgeois political economists. They blamed it on workers, and Marxist profit squeeze theories, they credited the workers for bringing the crisis by fighting for wages. But it goes against the basic Marxist logic and basic empirical evidence, because wage just can increase and at the same time profits can increase. It is possible to have a situation where the real wages are increasing due to the cheapening of wage goods, and yet the rate of profit is increasing. In fact, Marx's point is not that when the rate of surplus value falls, then rate of profit falls. His basic argument is that rate of profit falls precisely because of the ways in which rate of surplus values increase. So average rate of profit falls when the rate of surplus value in any given time frame reaches its ceiling. So profit squeeze theorists are basically not Marxists. They are followers of Bastiat and Carey. And on the basis of this, I come to my conclusion. Conclusion is this. It is Marxist theory of LTFRP, law of tendential fall in the rate of profit, which clearly shows and empirically and logically shows that barriers to capitalism are inherent in the immanent laws of motion of capital. The real barrier to accumulation is capital itself, and capital faces crisis not due to some exogenous factors, but its intrinsic laws of motion. And capitalism is a transient, historically transient system. It is not the end of history. All ruling classes have always proclaimed that their system is the end of history. Capitalists are doing nothing new. Postmodernists are doing nothing new. They are making the same claim. Second point of conclusion is that to have a correct crisis theory is essential for us. Why? Because without a correct crisis theory, you cannot have a correct politics. For example, if the problem is underconsumptionism, then the solution is increasing effective demand by states' welfare policies, a la Keynes. If the problem is disproportionality, then the solution is state regulation to maintain the proportionality, planned production, organized capitalism. No need to change the system. If the problem is over financialization, then the solution is regulation of financial sector. These theories are basically reformist theories of some kind, empirically incorrect, logically incorrect. Not we can reject them not because we can't say they are not prescribing revolution, so we are rejecting them. It's not like that. They are empirically and logically disproven by history. So to have a correct crisis theory is important to have a correct politics. And if we let the present moment of crisis, this moment pregnant with dual potential, this moment of revolution, this moment of socialism pass, our punishment will be reaction and fascism. And that's what we are facing right now. Right? So that is the line of demarcation between which political economy is radical and which is not. So here I will end my presentation. Thank you.
I'll address and then I'll pass it over again.
नहीं अभी सैंडविच तो नहीं खा पाऊंगा एक जाने से पहले खा अभी तुरंत
So, with that, we come to the conclusions by Abhinav Sinha. We would ask for questions. You can put that in those comment box in the YouTube live. But until we get the questions, I would like to ask the question that we have received online from the Google form that has been circulated. The first and the most prevalent one that we have got is, what is the role of white collar workers in the struggle of the working class? So I would pass the mic again to Abhinav. So if he could,
You can ask all the questions.
yeah, or and also the second one was, how would South Asia get her liberation from the chain of radical politics? Uh, how the new labor code will impact the life of labor? The question.
what was the second one? How would South Asia
That's what I've gotten right. How would South Asia get her liberation?
I think he's asking what kind of politics of liberation might lead to liberation of South Asia.
Okay.
I would answer only that. The other things can be answered by the gatekeeper of South.
So the other one is how the new labor code will impact the life of labor. Another question is role of left in the present crisis. And the last one is, can you talk about the U-shaped labor curve for women? So these are the questions that we have received online. We are also opening up our comment box in the live YouTube, so we can get more questions from the viewers. Over to you, Abhinav. Yeah.
And alongside, if anyone has questions,
Yeah,
they can.
they
Yeah.
can also.
You can. So, regarding the first question about the role of white-collared labor, I think here this is a very vague term. White-collared labor. White-collared labor doesn't, in totality, constitute labor aristocracy. Labor aristocracy is a political concept, not an economic concept as such, and we need to make a distinction between social class and political class, because then otherwise we run the risk of economism and what has been called mechanical Marxism, that white-collared labor cannot assume, a subversive position. That is not true. Uh, when we considered the political concept of labor aristocracy, as Lenin described it, labor aristocracy is the bearer of bourgeois political line within the working class movement. So, labor aristocracy, every member of labor aristocracy doesn't necessarily need to be part of white collared labor. It is possible for a blue collared labor to be part of labor aristocracy politically. Socially speaking, yes, the white collared labor, I mean, the well paid part of the proletariat, they might have a propensity to incline towards reformism. Socially speaking, not every particular member, socially speaking, they might have a greater propensity to incline towards reformist politics and all. But we should be very careful about this line of argumentation. If you see a lot of labor militancy which has been happening in the third world, it has happened not from the most poorly paid section of the working class. Sometimes it has happened in a factory like Maruti Suzuki, where the workers are not, as poorly paid as the, for example, the informal workers working in Mayapur in Arena or Wazirpur industrial area, or these, industrial areas. So we have to make a distinction between social class and political class here, and in general we have to make these are two different levels of determination, social and political. So in that sense, I think uh, when politicizing the working class, we cannot depart from a mechanical position that all emphasis has to be only on the most poorly paid part of the working class. The contradiction between labor and capital happens at the level of production. It is about workers struggle against the increasing intensity of labor. So the dispute, for example, in many automobile plants in the recent past began on the question of speeding up the process of production, speeding up the assembly line, fitting greater number of functions within the same minute. So that contradiction has to be understood in terms of production, not in terms of incomes. Income is a sociological measure, not totally useless, but while determining political line, it's not totally useful also. So I would, my plea would be to make a distinction between these two levels of determination, and we cannot reject the white collared labor. They also need to be organized, and the rate of exploitation is often higher in the advanced, industries like IT sector, or like automobile industry, or highly mechanized sectors of industry. Rate of exploitation is higher, and real wages are also higher, but rate of exploitation and the struggle over the two parts of new value which is created by direct labor, the two parts, wage and profit, that struggle emanates, or it is immanent to the very process of capitalist production, and we should be able to deal with the contradiction in a correct political way. So that is how I would say there is. So I would not say that it has any particular different role, the white collared labor. It has to be determined politically. Just because they are well paid, their political role cannot be differentiated on the basis of that only. Uh, then about the new labor code, I'll come to the second question later. About the new labor code are a response to the crisis of profitability itself. This the neoliberal onslaught, which is continuing from the 1970s itself, and which has intensified in the third world in the 1980s, 1990s, and especially since the beginning of the Great Depression, first Great Depression of the 21st century, from the subprime crisis 2007-8. We have seen rise to power of different kinds of extreme right-wing governments in different countries, including fascist government like in our country, and their aim, it is precisely a response to a crisis of profitability, and labor codes are precisely designed to increase the rate of profit by attacking the rights of the workers, which have been won after generations of struggle, 8-hour working day, a weekly off, pension, gratuity, ESI, all these rights, which the working class won through its organized struggle, they are being snatched away because there are no other way right now. There is no big leap of productivity. Now some things are happening and productivity is constantly being increased, but it is not sufficient. This increase in the rate of surplus value is not sufficient to do outstrip the rising organic composition of capital, and turn the tide of falling profitability. That's what Andrew Kleiman says. Andrew Kleiman says that in the why are we going through a long recession? We are going through a long recession because there is not sufficient devalorization of capital or destruction of productive forces, which happened in the First World War, Second World War. Now there is no large-scale devalorization of capital, and therefore capital has only one option at its hand, that is attacking the wages of the workers, attacking the labor rights of the workers, and that is precisely the design behind the new labor codes. So, and it will of course affect, and it is already affecting working class, because the labor laws which were there already, they were applicable only for the 7%, that is the real data, 7% of the industrial working class. So that 7%, what it was getting till now that also will be slowly snatched away through the new labor codes. For the rest of the 93 informal industrial working class, it was already the new labor codes ever since the independence. So, but yes, the situation will worsen. There is no doubt about it, and it is already happening. About the role of left in the present crisis, I think it's too big a question to answer in within the ambit of the present discussion. I would only say that the crisis of left consists in two problems. One problem, and I'm using this term generically now because this is a very vague term. What is left? I always had hard time understanding what is left, because the genealogy of the term is that those who sat on the left in the British Parliament were left, called leftists. So, but then again, left of whom? Someone looking from the front or sitting there? Again, there is a problem. So anyway, the basic problem is that generically talking and accepting the question on its face value, two problems. One is the problem of what Lenin called parliamentary cretinism, that is social democratic left, revisionist left, which how can we narrow down the basic agenda of the parliamentary left into one succinct sentence? It is simply this: limit popular struggles within the ambit of bourgeois legality. That is the basic aim of parliamentary left, and that's what it does. Reformist parliamentary left. That is one problem which is plaguing the left in general right now. And the second is the problem of left adventurism. Those who do not believe in the basic, ideological prejudice in the positive sense of Marx, that masses make history. Weapons don't make history. They take Mao's dictum in the literal sense that power comes out of the barrel of a gun. Mao is only repeating what Engels said, that there is a role of force in history. It doesn't mean that guns make history. It just means that there is always a role of force in historical movements, and masses make history. So left adventurous, the so-called Naxalites or CPI Maoist and different these kind of organization, despite their some would argue bravery and sacrifice and all. Yes, that's true. But if bravery and sacrifice could have changed history, it would have changed history long time back. You need to understand the science of revolution in order to realize it. And these two extremes are basically mirror image of each other. So one is pathological reaction of the other. These are disjunctive synthesis, dialectical others of uh, one another. So that is the basic problem. And once the left is able to study the concrete situation, concrete conditions of Indian society in a creative Marxist manner, get rid of the dogma of you know semi-feudal, semi-colonial. India is a semi-feudal, semi-colonial country. So this is like, some people are there who want to do Chinese revolution in India. But the thing is, China had already had Chinese revolution. We have to do Indian revolution in India. Revolution of India based on Indian conditions. It doesn't mean that we are proposing some kind of revision of Marxist science and Marxist philosophy itself. We are just, our humble plea is that application of Marxist science and philosophy in the concrete conditions of India in a creative manner, move beyond the dogma of new democratic revolution and semi-feudal, semi-colonial, move beyond the reformist parliamentary left and its social democratic cretinism, and move beyond the romantic revolutionism of the left adventurist uh, left. But again, I know I must have raised more questions than answered, and that's why I said that within the ambit of present discussion, it is very difficult to answer all these questions. But I'm open to further discussion, and we can have further discussion on these questions. The second question, as I could understand, what kind of politics of liberation can liberate Southeast Asia? That's what I think the comrade meant. And that again is a very, very, very big question. But one thing I would say, politics has a universality. So for different countries and for different questions, you don't need different kinds of politics. For example, some people in India within, for questions within the country, would say for women liberation we need feminism, for Dalit liberation we need Ambedkarism, for workers liberation we need Marxism. And they talk of a kind of an aggregative equationalism. So workers' resistance plus Dalit resistance plus women resistance plus, so, and in the same vein, I can, this is foolish and stupid to the extent of lunacy. Why? Because the question of liberation has a, you know, universality about it, and oppression of different identities within the society, marginal identity. It is not created in a vacuum. It is created in the moment of class, and it is created in the framework of class. So class is not an identity. Class is a social relation of production. So in that sense, this kind of aggregative equationalism doesn't give answer to any question. And that is true for different nations also. For example, there are some is a Latin American left that talks about Bolivarian alternative, and it says that the Bolivarian alternative is specifically applicable, or indigenous Marxism is applicable in Panama or Colombia, and indigenous to what? And exogenous to what? So these are questions that we need to raise. If you ask me, it is the revolutionary science of Marxism that can engender the concrete revolutionary politics for all countries of South Asia. Why only South Asia? All countries of the world. So my answer would be like that. But again, I know it would raise more questions than give answers. So this again is open to discussion, further discussion. Oh, about the U-shaped curve, I don't know what that is. So I won't speak on that. As Mao said, huh?
Generally, as countries develop, foreign labor force participation of women.
You reach a bottom and then.
And as a developing world, so India is taken as an exception where you have lower.
I don't think that is that can be held empirically for many countries. It's not true. It doesn't happen like that. It can be shown empirically that the pattern is much more turbulent than a simple view, and it depends on many other factors implicit in class dynamic of the capitalist system of the particular country that we are talking about, and the intersection of class exploitation with different forms of social oppression. But I don't think that such a generalization could be made in terms not only of India, in terms of any country. But then again, you can use a third degree on a set of data and make them speak anything that you want to.
So, I could get the mic. Yeah. So I would like to thank you all for joining us. Thank you everyone who have joined online, and the biggest thank you goes to Abhinav Sinha for leading this session, not only with such depth and clarity, but also standing up against the bureaucratic. Anyway, so thank you everyone for the participation. Please keep an eye out in our DSG profiles for more such sessions, hopefully inside the campus. Thank you.